Right, so my first response is to the question of gender. It doesn't surprise me in a femicidal country like South Africa that we have the kind of skewed approach that we have. The person who asked the question mentioned the fact that we have representatives in Parliament. And I think this leads me to my response around bureaucratic and state bureaucracy as the measure by which we make progress in this society. Simply because you have a group of people from a particular, people from what is identified as a group present, doesn't mean that that group's interests will be served. We know this from classical Marxist theory, issues of interpolation. People often understand the world in terms that are not just not in their interest, but actually work against their interests. And so this idea that, and we've got this in other forms, in other situations in the world, that the Britain under Margaret Thatcher was not a particularly woman-friendly Britain, and women's rights were not advanced under it. And I think we're about to fall into the same trap because there's an assumption that any woman will make South Africa a better woman-friendly place if that woman is the president. And I think we forget that this return to essentialism is not strategic, because I'm all for going through feminist standpoint theory, strategic essentialism. But what I often see is essentialism without strategy. And you often hear this in these so-called debates, because I'm slightly more pessimistic than some of my other panelists, particularly Iva, in this idea that there is a debate out there. I think there is a lot of information and very little meaning. And this goes across all class barriers. This is not just that, and I agree with Aubrey, that I don't think this is just that there are thinking classes in 702 land and ENCA land, and there are unthinking people doing, I agree with Aubrey, that actually you see some of the most fundamentally intellectually engaged readings of the society by people who aren't placed in institutions. Whether those institutions are corporate, whether those institutions are intellectual university think tanks. Of the university, I left the university environment after 20 horrific years of coming in and being lucky in a particular moment to have been educated into a certain kind of literacy through philology. And what I found over the 20 years, and this is what I call the first Bengofication of higher education, followed by Asmalification, followed by Pandorification, followed by the cutting blade. Right? So I found myself more and more doing really unintellectual work. And when I left the academy, I could do the work that I thought I was joining the academy for, which was to read. The academics who don't read are not academics, they're clerks. And I think the system has turned people into clerks. But the second component, which links back to my initial point, is in a society that has had the education cock-ups of post-apartheid South Africa, which is not to glorify the mediocrity of apartheid South African education at all. Please, white liberal universities were as banal and mediocre as their black Bush College counterparts. They had the same insularity, they just had more resources and a slightly kind of elevated sense of respect. So when people tell me, oh, I have a degree from University X from 1985, I go, oh, well, that's interesting. So you have a mediocre apartheid era degree. Because if somebody said to you, I have a degree from the University of Berlin in 1939 in history, what would you make of them? You wouldn't celebrate them, you would go, yay. If somebody said you have a degree from the University of Sofia in Bulgaria from 1983, remember how everybody in this country poo-pooed Snooki Zikalala for his Bulgarian degree? And yet we're expected to say that somebody who has a degree from Rhodes, or once taught at Rhodes, is somehow better than somebody who has a degree from the University of Transkei, on the basis of nothing other than old prejudices. We need to look at what the content of somebody's speech is, rather than the credentials that they come to the conversation with. And too often we're stuck in these kinds of very strange, old ideas of what is valuable and what is not, who is invisibilized, who is elevated. If I did not have these speech inflections, I would not have the position I have today, and I'm very much aware of it. If I spoke with a speech inflection that matched the skin tone that many people in this country assume I should have, I would not have the position I have today. And the number of people with flat vowels who come up to me and go, you're so well spoken. And you want to go, well, that's a pity because you just aren't. Is a phenomenon that I think is about unlearning old patterns that in this country haven't been unlearned. Where is the center, where is the margin? So in terms of women's positions in this country, other forms of so-called minorities who are actually the numerical majority, let's distinguish between the sociological minority and the actual numerical minority. That's never done. And I go with, I went to the 19th century with John Stuart Mill. I'm a lot more pessimistic, so I go to the early 20th century with Ortega y Gasset. The ability of the common mind to assert itself and take itself seriously and be taken seriously. If you are ill, you are not feeling well, your heart is busy beating in a way that you don't think it should, and you suddenly think, let me go see a doctor. You don't think, the doctor says I should have a heart transplant because of X, Y, or Z, but I'm going to do a mass poll and find what the demos has to tell me. Right? You don't do this. Why is it when we have social problems, we don't actually think that the people who experience the problem, who have thought about it, or not necessarily the people with the degrees, could have something useful to contribute, rather than just the people who have that problem and have a speech about it. Just because you think of yourself as having a race, whatever that means, doesn't mean you can contribute usefully to the solution of racism. I have a kidney, but I can't necessarily operate on myself should I develop some kind of renal failure. So this is not to valorize expertise, but you don't need to have been in a university to think about a problem and come up with solutions. And too often, there is an assumption that formal education is necessarily expertise. My last comment is actually that in a country that has seen the education situation that we've seen over the last 20 years, why are we surprised that we have the kind of political non-debate that we have? If basic education is what it is, you don't have critically literate citizens. And if you don't have critically literate citizens, those with access to power and control get away with a lot more. So not delivering textbooks to Limpopo cannot just be dismissed as some kind of logistical flaw. Teachers who are not in classrooms teaching isn't just some kind of accident. At some point you have to admit this is what the society has designed once, because it wants replaceable labour units that can serve a neoliberal agenda, where those of us who sit in nice middle-class neighbourhoods can afford the kinds of things that we need to have our lifestyles supported. Underpaid cashiers in insecure labour at supermarkets that we don't really have to acknowledge. The beggars on the streets are awful, but actually I do need somebody who's going to be underpaid to clean my house. I need somebody who's going to be willing to take less money to take care of my elderly parents come that moment in their lives. This idea that the society accidentally looks the way it does is obscene. This society looks the way it does because we designed it in that way. And when in 2015 young people stood up and said to us, the society that you gave us is unacceptable, what did the majority of middle class and educated and elite South Africans do? They delegitimated that particular protest. Ironically, in 2016, in the 40th anniversary of 1976 that they were celebrating at the same time. What kind of dissonance does this require? What kind of intellectual fraud do you have to exercise where it's unacceptable for students to rise up against the inequality that you've created over 20 years in the year that you celebrate students rising up 20 years before that? How absurd is this? And to me, I'm not saying this because I want the applause. I'm saying this because it deeply distresses me when there's this kind of blanket phenomenon of the solution is out there, when the solution is being told to you is not the solution. We have that extreme center that was being spoken of. Today I read an email from somebody who actually praised political centrism, as if this is the space we should be in. As if political centrism isn't what got us to this level of inequality. Now it helps that this person lives in Hout Bay, right? I can also praise political centrism sitting in Killarney, but when I deal with family members of mine who do not sit in Killarney, when I deal with people who don't live in the kind of Killarney I live in, political centrism is not the solution. And that's where I agree with Jane. Loony voices, and sometimes I'm explained away as a loony voice, are absolutely essential, but they're not necessarily going to be on mainstream television. And my last point is this. We forget that this is a country that has actively connected, pulled apart its public service broadcasting system. So when you're talking about education, it's not just schools and universities, it's also the public broadcaster. And if you've actively dismantled the public broadcaster, one space in which critically literate education could have gone, or just basic education of a certain kind, is gone. There was a time when you could listen to lectures on nursing that I had no interest in, but learned something from, because UNISA was doing lectures to students on radio. You don't get that. What you get instead is Skippy from Killarney with airtime and an anger bin phoning into the radio station to moan. Somebody sitting in a car to moan about how badly everybody else is driving around them, and nobody says, are you using a hands-free set? If you are not using a hands-free set, we should end this call because you are contributing to the problem. And that is just a little analogy for what always happens in these spaces. People who contribute to the problem are supposedly going to solve it. Why would middle-class people like me ever be really interested and committed to changing inequality? The very quality of our lives depend on this inequality. It's why we live here. It's why we sit in NGOs and argue about inequality, when we draw the kinds of salaries that replicate the inequality, where the cleaner who cleans the NGO office earns 1/100th of what the director earns on foreign money. So we can't complain about CEOs doing sleep out and how obscene that is, and then go into your NGO where somebody makes your tea for you. You can't come onto a public university property without a ticket. When you get here, there is VIP parking. Is there some sort of sad analogy? Are we doing political parody, or are we doing psychiatric cabaret? Is this a symptom recital of the society we live in? So we moan about things, but actually we live them, and we require those things in order to live.